Bonjour mes amis, domo samedes. How are you all doing today? Swimmingly well, I hope. I'm very good with puns. As for myself, I am good, even though I feel like today's subject's gonna be a bit, fishy. You probably guessed it, today we're gonna go dive deep into the depths of the sea. I'm the Elegant Dandy, and you're watching Elegantly Explain Gawr Gura. Now, if you're watching this video, the chances that you know who Gawr Gura is are rather high. But just in case, let me give you a quick reminder. Gawr Gura, also called Goomba or Shork, is an English VTuber from what we call the Holomyth. She debuted in 2020 and very quickly took over the stage and took the #1 spot in the whole Hololive thing. Calling her a short stack would be an understatement, as she's 141 centimeters, which is smaller than my nephew, who's 10. Anyways, she perfectly encapsulates the flat justice thing, and she's probably, in my opinions after all, one of the funniest streamers out there. She's very interesting to look at. Now, this is just a bit of context and chit-chat, because what's actually interesting comes after this. Gawr Gura, or Kuba, is a shark, or, according to her terms, a shark. But she's not just any shark. She's coming from the Atlantis and is holding a trident in her hand. Now, this is what we're looking for. For now, let's start with the trident, as it is the fastest to cover of all our topics. It is a 3-pronged spear mostly used for fishing at the time, or, as we'll cover, in gladiators fight. But first, let's talk about the etymology of the word. As you might expect, the word trident comes from the Latin tridentis, which itself comes from the word triena. Forgive my poor pronunciation. Tridentis means 3 teeth, and triena means threefold. So this is done. Now let's talk about the actually interesting things. The trident, weapon of the god of the sea Poseidon, it was said to have been forged by the Cyclops, who were legendary weaponsmiths. Another one of their creation would be the thunderbolt of Zeus. Now, there are few stories about Poseidon's trident. One of them stating that by hitting a rock with the weapon, he caused the whole sea to appear near Athens' Acropolis. Or that with it, he could create earthquakes, and that when the tridents hit the earth, it had produced the first war horses. But my favorite isn't any of those. The weapon was honored even during the Roman era, and it was especially so during the fight opposing the Rhaecyres, fighters armed with a trident and a net, to the Myrmilonis. In these fights, the script was thus: a humble fisherman would fish a giant sea monster, here impersonated by the Myrmilonis, and therefore fight it to the death. Now, I believe we said everything we had to say about the trident, so what about now taking a quick dip? So, I expect you all know of the Atlantis. Or do you? The common way people see the Atlantis is thus: an underwater civilization lost to time that we still have yet to discover. You're all wrong. This is not the Atlantis. Or rather, not exactly. Atlantis is a place full of mystery, and now it is lying under the waves, but it was not always the case. Way back then, in an era lost to time, the peoples of the Atlantis lived 9,600 years before Plato himself. And let's remember, Plato lived around 2,300 years before us. This place is older than our concept of time. Anyways, let's get back to our topic. Back then, the island was massive, larger than Libya and Asia fused together. An island the size of a continent. A question to the world's logic, reason, and physics. Truly, this place had no right to be, and yet, it was. As I said, Atlantis hasn't always been lying under the waves of the ocean. Once it was a beautiful, thriving society. The land was generous and the trees grew fruits every day of the year. The soils were filled with precious metals such as gold and silver, and, of course one that will become a legend, as it is today impossible to find, the orichalcum. The fauna was the most magnificent the world has ever seen, full of colorful exotic animals. The culture was brilliant and the cities were filled to the brim with intellectuals, architects and philosophers. It was everything Athens was during Plato's era, and more. Indeed, rarely has the world ever seen such a wonder. This place had everything anyone could ever ask for, but this was its downfall. Atlantis was great, so great in fact that it got overtaken by greed and hubris. And this is the story of how the Atlantis fell deep into the sea. Now, let's talk about it in more details, shall we? The first things the god did was to divide the earth, so that each of them had its own land. And to his liking, Poseidon, great god of the sea, was bequeathed with the Atlantis. Here, the children he had with a mortal woman would live and flourish. On the seaside, coming from the center of the island, was a large plain which would pass as the most fertile and beautiful of all. In the center of this island, giving birth to the plain, a very small mountain would rise, and this is where one man who were birthed from this very earth would live. His name was Evenor, and he lived there with his wife Leucippe. Together, they would have only one child. Her name was Clito. When the young woman was old enough to marry, her father and mother died. But this is just the beginning of a story, because Poseidon fell in love with the woman and soon enough married her, and out of this love, the god made sure that his deer would be protected by the very same mountain she lived in. He fortified the hill, cutting it and rebuilding it so that soon enough the whole place was made out of ring, the larger surrounding the smaller, and in between them there would be entire seas protecting it from any threat. Soon the hill would become an island in the center of another island, separated from another by, as I said, an entire sea. The work of the god was truly marvelous. From small protection, the land and the seas became a shield. But this work was not finished. Using his godly powers, Poseidon made two springs come out of the earth. One was cold, the other was hot. Then, to make sure Clito and his future children wouldn't need anything, he made it so that the earth would produce anything the mortals would need. Trees sprouted out of the ground, full of fruits. Cattle would soon appear and the life would spring in this god-blessed land. Together with Clito, Poseidon would have 10 children. They would raise them and then split the entire island in 10 parts. The first one and the oldest would inherit his mother's home and her land, which was the most flourishing and beautiful of all. He was crowned king and made his 9 brothers lord, giving to each of them a great number of men to rule over and lands to govern. The first son was named Atlas, and he would soon enough give his name to the entire island, the island of Atlas, Atlantis. The second son, to whom was given the land facing the pillars of Heracles, was named Eumelos. The third and fourth, Ampheres and Evaimon. The fifth and sixth, Mneseus and Autochton. The seventh and eighth, Elasippos and Mestor. And finally, Esaes and Diaprepes were the last. For long years, these 10 children of the god of the sea would rule over their island and the ocean, expanding their empire and conquering the known world. With all the riches the people of Atlantis possessed, they would quickly make the world an even more beautiful place through their architecture and technology. However, such grandeur would not last. The Atlantids would try to step on Athens and vanquish them through war. What a poor decision it was. Athens was back then way greater than it was during the time of Plato and had controlled over the armies of Egypt and Greece. The battle was bloody, but Athens did vanquish. However, the gods didn't like this war. The men separated themselves from the ways of the gods and they needed to be punished. The men of Athens were swallowed by the earth, and with them their technology and work. The ones of Atlantis suffered a fate that was not much better. Let me recite Critias on that. But afterward there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea, for which reason the sea in those parts is now impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. And this is how Atlantis sank into the depths of the ocean. How it is today, nothing but a myth, a legend, and maybe a lesson for us not to give ourselves to hubris and greed. The gods are quick to punish after all. Now, last thing I'd like to mention to come back to the main topic of this video. Gawr Gura possesses a word that made me tick the first time I heard it. Gura. It sounds oddly like gula, which means gluttony in Latin. Gluttony and greed really aren't that far from one another, are they? Très bien, I believe I had everything to say. My dear shrimpy friends, I wish you all a wonderful day. I hope to see you next week too. Au revoir, and beware of the jaws.